Welcome back to another episode of the Rankable Podcast. My name is Garrett Sussman of iPullRank, and each week I talk to folks in the SEO world. But this is a special episode because I'm talking to a doctor in the world of NLP. I'm joined by Rachael Tatman. Now, Rachael is a language technology educator. She writes for her blog, Making Noise and Hearing Things. She's got a lot of entrepreneurial pursuits in the works. And basically, her mission is to make NLP boring. That's kind of like the catchphrase. She has a PhD in computational linguistics, focus on computational sociolinguistics. I mean, you're a data scientist. You're an advocate at Kaggle. You do everything. You got an adorable little dog named Benson who might be in the background. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rachael. How you doing?
Good. Yourself?
I'm doing really well. And also, so you stream live on YouTube like every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10. You talk all NLP, right? What do you do in those sessions?
Yeah, I should say that's 10 a.m. Eastern time because there's a lot of time zones
all over.
Yeah. So on Tuesdays, I'll do a deep dive into something, really just going in depth. And then Thursdays, it's more breadth. And I call it the coffee chat, where we just talk about the week in review. So this week is going to be so we're recording this on a Wednesday. So I'm talking about what's going to happen on Thursday. A lot of research to cover because this week was NACL, which is the North American Association of Computational Linguistics. So a lot of linguistics research came out, computational linguistics, NLP research. And also this is the week that Hugging Face released their Bloom multilingual model. Some really interesting stuff there. They developed a new license to release it under. So Thursdays, we talk about everything that I think is relevant and cool. And then on Tuesdays, we go really deep into something. So last Tuesday, we did a code review of some code I wrote 8 years ago that was not good code.
I know we're always our worst critics, but it's like, when you learn so much, you go back and you're like, I could have completely reframed that and done it differently. And
yes,
I mean, refactoring code is so many developers' favorite pastime, but I'm excited to talk about, this overlap in NLP, Google as a, service, search engine is fascinating. It's a big black box, but they give us peeks under it, under the hood. And so a few years ago, they introduced BERT. And so we want to talk about kind of language models, how they might affect, for instance, the tool, like how Google provides the best results. So can you tell me a little bit about how you think about BERT and more specifically, how it applies to Google, like what research you've done?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing to know about language models is sort of their history and what they used to be, and honestly, where I think they still make sense. And they are part of the NLP pipeline, right? So you have raw text or, speech or signed data, language data as input. And then as output, you have something useful, right? So, maybe a ranking of documents, very relevant to search. Maybe it's you're extracting named entities. Give me just a second. I got a little bit of frog in my throat.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to have a little coffee as well.
All right. And language models are part of that pipeline. And historically, they have been based on just counts of words. And the specific thing they do is given a input of text, they will tell you based on a corpus how likely that text is, right? So this is useful in things like in automatic speech recognition. If I have two candidate outputs, right? So let's say one is recognize speech, 2 words, and the other is rec a nice beach, 4 words. Which of those is more likely in the context of the document? And it would help you select the more likely of the 2 outputs. And that would be trained based on, corpus linguistics techniques, counting stuff, statistical language models. And then BERT came out in, the Attention Also Is All You Need paper came out in 2017. I want to say 2019 was the publication date, but it was definitely around before then. And BERT is, obviously it's based on a completely different way of doing the math. So it's based on a deep learning model and specifically something called a transformer. So if you're familiar with things like recurrent neural networks, it's not that. It's a completely different architecture. So you'd have like convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, and then transformers. It's a different family of architectures. And what's special about it is it pays attention to everything without really considering how close the things occur, right? So in a recurrent neural network, you step over a sequence, and things that are closer in the sequence get handled as being more influential. Whereas in a transformer, you look at everything, and then you assign weights, basically attention to each of the items based on what it is that you're doing. As a very, very simple example. And the reason that you would use a transformer and the reason why these were exciting is you can parallelize that much better, right? So recurrent neural network, you need to have done each time step in sequence. So there is a bottleneck there in terms of not necessarily clock time, but there's a bottleneck in terms of compute time. You have to go through the sequence. Whereas in a transformer, you're looking at everything, so you can completely parallelize that. Each step does not depend on the previous step. So transformers, much, much bigger. One of the very first major applications of transformers were these language models, and BERT is, probably well known, one of the big ones. There've been a lot since. So GPT-3, GPT-4, various multimodal models like DALL-E that include, images as well, T5, a bunch of them, and they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and having more and more and more parameters. But the thing about BERT is that Google folded it into search. Which I'm sure is not news to any of y'all.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's the implication of that? Like, why does that make search better? And what do you anticipate going forward? Like, what are some ways that you see that in Google?
Great question. So I talked about sort of the architecture and why this is exciting and new. What I didn't talk about is the specific tasks that it's trained on and what the ramifications are for that of the way that language data is handled and produced, basically. So BERT works on if you ever played like Mad Libs,
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
Where you have, a bunch of text and one of the words has been removed and you have to put the word back in there. And in Mad Libs, you don't have context of the word. You just know something about what it's supposed to be. BERT has the context and is trying to get the right word in there. So it's trying to replace the Mad Lib word. And that's how it's trained, right? So you have a bunch of texts. I don't think we actually know precisely all the texts that were used to train BERT. Similarly with GPT-3, I don't think we know specifically what texts were used to train it, but certainly a lot of web data. And the sort of hiding a word and then revealing it means that you get a lot of weight in the context that it occurs. So a simple example would be something like not like sense disambiguation. So something like, I'm going to the bank. So if the rest of the discussion is about all the chores I'm doing and I'm talking about how I'm living in the city, probably bank there is financial institution. But if I'm camping and, we're by a river and I say, hey, I'm going to the bank, I mean of the river. So those are two words with the same surface form that have different senses. And the benefit of using a contextual language model like this, rather than just sort of using a bag of words where you don't think about context, you just count raw things, is that you know more about the context. So given BERT, there would, in theory, be more disambiguation there. And in search results, in theory, again, the context should make the search results more relevant. There's something else there that is also relevant, though. I'm just going to say relevant a lot. And that is that, Google autocomplete search results. I'm sure you know.
Yes.
And also a lot of people use voice input for search results. Now, I do not know for a fact that people are using BERT specifically in, say, the Gboard voice input. But what I have noticed using voice input on various devices is a shift in that voice input where the output, the text output, is less likely given the phonetic. So given just the speech sound, it's less likely. But given sort of the corpus of the internet, it is more likely. So I mentioned that was one of the original uses of language models. I'm getting the impression as a user, and again, this is just my intuition as a language technologist, that those language models are being upweighted in other places as well. So you're going to end up with, I would imagine, a higher degree of centralization and a higher degree of conformity, even if the desires behind putting that text in is not necessarily becoming more congruent, if that makes sense. So there's going to be a little bit of I would expect to see sort of like a funneling effect where more diverse underlying things are shifted to be less diverse.
So I'm curious of what you think like the search results end of game of that is, because you think about from an SEO perspective, to your point in the evolution of these algorithms is like, we used to think specifically about keywords as an SEO, like, yeah. And we even learned that when we search, right? Like we just put in, I need to like look up the specific word. But now with these more complex algorithms like BERT and the voice search, you can have a conversational search and get closer to what you're looking for. But you're saying the algorithm isn't necessarily 100%. Like you're going to still see this kind of certain type of content will appear because it's like trying its best.
Yeah, basically that's there's more. So moving from something that's more rule-based, like keywords, right? AOL back in the day,
right?
To something that's more machine learning based, you're going to get a lot more fuzziness. So you're in a machine learning setting, you're always going to get a guess. Whether or not it's a helpful guess or a relevant guess is secondary. And yeah, so the big benefit to the user should be that you can use more naturalistic language. Assuming that naturalistic language is like the language that BERT was trained on originally. Now, BERT was trained by Google. Yeah. Google has access to perhaps obviously a lot of data and also knows how it's being used in search ranking, which is information they're not super forthcoming with, is my understanding, as someone who doesn't work in SEO.
Right. But it's ongoing change, right? Like, because obviously the context of everything is always changing. I think you wrote about, in terms of like youth culture and using a word like lit or based, like has a different meaning now than it might have a few years ago.
Yeah, and that is one potential thing about BERT, is that it was trained at a point in time with data that it was available at that point in time. So I think it's in the tokenization, right? So the taking of the text and breaking it into words. I'm not entirely sure how much of this is going to be review for y'all. Not every year has a token, right? And it includes a lot of future years because they were less represented in the data. So over time, BERT as a specific language model trained on a specific data set, the base model that they told us about in the paper is going to be less and less relevant. That said, you can take these models and you can do what's called fine tuning. So you add additional data that's relevant to your use case. You may add an additional task for it to do to get rewarded when it does well and like sort of pushed away from when it does badly. And that fine tuning data can be used to sort of update the model. I believe BERT uses word piece, which I believe you can add vocabulary words to. I'd have to triple check that to make sure, but I'm pretty sure that's my intuition and what I remember. So there are ways to mitigate that. And also, Google's been continuing to train different large language models. I say Google, I know DeepMind's been working on it as well. So yeah, that is definitely something to think about. There may be a little bit of, calcification of the 2016 internet in search results, which, I don't know how you get around that. And I'm sure that, people who are working in search engines and building the search engines are thinking about that. Because of course, if you don't want to only consider news that happened in 2016 and before in your ranking. But yeah, definitely something that could be a concern.
And so it's fascinating because, it's a language technology as an industry is just, it's almost like Moore's law, right? Because it's like, it's growing and getting and accelerating. You focus a lot on new language technology, and you see all these things come out. How do you anticipate, if you had to put your little, prediction clairvoyance cap on, the future of search when it comes to language tech? Like what direction could you anticipate it going in?
Great question. So I think there's a couple things there. So one is I'm imagining we'll continue to see this trend away from, tagging, for example, and hashtags, and more towards looking at the content of the post. So this is just scuttlebutt, but someone recently told me that Instagram is sort of downweighting the hashtags and upweighting the text of the post in their sort of recommendation and top post ranking. And I don't know that is true, but that's what I've been told. Verification needed. So yes, moving more towards natural language data. The other thing that I would definitely be on a lookout for, and this is more just sort of in general affecting all technology, but particularly things that are based on machine learning, is there's been a lot of legislation coming through. So, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Marketing Act, the both just passed in the EU. There's a couple of bills in Congress in the US, and it's very much an ongoing discussion about what technologies should we be able to apply in which situations, and why and when, et cetera. So definitely, I expect in the next 5 years, the allowable uses of language technology to be reduced significantly from legislation. I don't know necessarily what that's going to look like. I think that language technology is probably going to be less impacted than computer vision technology. So I imagine vision-based searches are going to be a little bit more impacted than text-based searches. People being able to remove themselves from searches. So obviously there was that recent court case in Argentina about the right to be forgotten. But also I would say there's been sort of a general move towards data privacy and the ability to control and remove your data, certainly in the EU, a little bit in the US, which I think will also affect, what information is available. And then the third thing is, if you've not worked with one of these large language models like BERT, GPT-3, et cetera, the way that you interact with them, if you are not using them as part of a pipeline with other things appended to them, and in my professional opinion, that's where they work best, right? Is when they're fulfilling the role that language models are designed for, and you have different, seatbelts, let's call them, to protect users from what the model chooses to do. Is this task called prompt engineering? Are you familiar with this? I'm sure you've seen it discussed.
No, I'm not.
Yeah? Oh, okay. So the way that you would work with a model like GPT-3 or 4 or BERT, if you are not using it as a part of a pipeline, is they generate text, right? So you would give them some prompt text, and then they would generate output. And the task of prompt engineering is to write the input that gives you the output you want. So a common example of a type of prompt engineering is if I want to answer a question, right? So if I'm building a question answering system, I'll have an example question, right? And I'll format it with like capital Q, colon, space, text of the question, next line, capital A, colon, space, text of the answer, add a blank line, Q colon, text the question, A colon, and then have the model auto-complete from there. So it's almost, I guess it's almost the reverse of SEO, kind of. It's sort of like a weird sister.
It's actually interesting, and it comes up in the world of SEO a lot because there is this debate right now about natural language generation and using it to produce content for the purpose of surfacing on search, and whether that's either ethically or just, if it's just problematic in general, because is the quality there to the extent where it's just like gobbledygook? Like, there's, to your point about GPT-3 and these new engines that are coming out, they're very capable, but yet they, in the SEO world, people are like, well, we're not there yet. You can't depend on it. No. What do you think?
Absolutely do not depend on it. In fact, my professional advice is to never serve or show the raw output of a language model to users in any capacity. And the reason for this is that it's been trained to fill in the blank, right? It's been trained on the internet. It's really good. All this sort of suite of models are really good at producing language that looks like it was written by a human, right? It has the form of human language, assuming that human language is English, or maybe one of a small handful of other languages. So there's an equity question about like who gets access to these extremely expensive, extremely energy intensive models. But the text that is output is not what we would call grounded in NLP. So it will produce things that look correct that are not. And it is guaranteed to have this behavior because it is not guaranteed not to have it, if that makes sense. And it wasn't trained to do this, right? It's completely unreasonable and unfair to expect a system to do this. But I think a lot of people have been, bamboozled, perhaps. Humans really want to see meaning in things, and we really want to believe that when we see language, it's coming from something like us. So I'm thinking about here the Google engineer who, I should be clear, in his capacity as a priest, believed that he claimed that he believed that GPT-3 was sentient, which I think is wrong. to be very blunt about it. It's
like
just
he
wrong,
basically
right?
got tricked by a computer.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Because it produces human looking language. And Janelle, whose last name is escaping me right now, but who does a lot of sort of art projects around GPT-3, then released something that was GPT-3 proves that it's a squirrel, in the same sort of like prompt and response way of interacting with this model. So never do that.
Right.
And I think there's also a larger societal question of how much trust does society have left in the utility of the internet as a place to find information? And this is something I think about a lot as a language technologist, because I want to build things that make people's lives better, which means they need to trust it enough to use it. And I think we are degrading that trust by doing things like releasing, language models and just letting people produce text with them. And, there's the flip side, that maybe releasing these models lets people understand their drawbacks and limitations and deficits and, inoculates, you might say, our population against falling for them, basically. But, even people who have a really strong technological background can get, suckered in.
Oh yeah, no, I can think of it like a parallel that, like, I used to work in the local space, and the whole thing with online reviews is a perfect example of that, where absolutely. You have all these fake reviews. And so, the review is almost an economy where it's like, in the world of business, if you have good reviews, you're going to get more business. But if you don't trust the reviews to be genuine or real, then you lose that completely. And then reviews have zero value.
Absolutely. Or, you're searching for a specific type of object, you get 1,000 results that are like top 5 ranked, and you click on them and you're like, this is an Amazon affiliate link farm. That's all this is. And if the entire top 2 pages of search results are that, people are just going to stop doing it, right? They're just going to stop having trust in the system and not have belief that it's safeguarding them and that, we have their best interests at heart, which I genuinely believe most engineers do, right? Like, I don't think you get into the field usually because you want to build bad stuff and destroy the world. I hope that's my belief.
But no, to that point, it's like the one last topic I'd love to touch on too, like kind of relevant, is the ethics of all of this. One thing I've seen in the world of SEO as well too, in terms of the results, is almost biased results based on the query that you put in. So for instance, the example I saw was in gendered in romance languages where, and I think you've touched on this in the past, where there's like a male gendered word. And so the results are all male related results. And so that's not like ethical. It's not like balanced. It's not a fair type of result. And that's a problem with linguistic technology, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's, particularly a problem in machine translation, I would say. Or it's not just a problem there, but that is where it's particularly easy to notice. Because if you translate from a language that does not have grammatical gender, or let's say they have 3 grammatical genders, including the neuter. So German would be an example there. I'm pretty sure Turkish also has a neuter. And then you translate it back into a language with only 2 grammatical genders, what comes out, right? Or do you get a gendered pronoun where previously there was like a gender neutral pronoun? And in doing so, are you replicating stereotypes and biases? And the answer is yes. And in general, there was a paper at NACL, actually, and I can dig up the citation if you're interested. But basically what they found was that bigger models have, more stereotypes, particularly when they make mistakes. And like I mentioned before, any machine learning method is guessing. It's going to be guaranteed to make mistakes. If anyone says, this machine learning model is 100% accurate, back away, keep your hand on your wallet. They are lying to you. They are misinforming you about their system capabilities. And then of course, if you have internet data being folded into the machine learning models that are then being folded into the thing you use to search the internet data, it's self-reinforcing. So, yeah, very important to think about.
This is so fun to talk, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I appreciate your time because this is just fascinating stuff, and it's cool to hear like a technologist really talk through these linguistic problems that we see in the SEO world constantly. Now I realize you are not necessarily in like SEO in the day to day, but I still want you to join us and do this rapid fire ranking. So, are you ready for some rapid fire rankings about NLP?
I'm ready.
Okay, so first off, completely unrelated. You are a coffee drinker. You're obsessed with coffee. What are your top 3 coffees?
So number 1, Cortado, absolutely designed to be drunk right away, which is how I like my coffee immediately. And then, I like a lungo or a doppio, and then a bonbon, which is like a espresso with sweet condensed milk in it, basically equal quantities. That sounds really good right now.
Oh my gosh, I'm doing my research. I'm going to go get that after this.
You should.
What is your number 1 NLP language model that you're just a fan of?
That is a great question. I think I'm actually going to say it's more of a class of doing them. And I like the statistical language models. I think that they are very transparent. And I think that they work well for situations where you don't have a lot of data, which is most of the time in NLP.
I love it. Okay, so you just went to NACL. What was your biggest takeaway from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I went in the way that you do it online,
virtually, and you hear stuff.
Yeah, great question. There's a lot going on. So that me looking up is me thinking really hard about it. And I think fundamentally that, researchers care, right? We care about doing a good job. We care about building things that help people. We care about understanding systems, and we care about understanding languages. And I think that is good and valuable and should be celebrated.
That is awesome. Okay, so if you were pointing someone in the direction of the world of NLP, who are 1 to 3 people that you admire and look up to?
Oh, great question. She's a little bit tangential to NLP, but Abeba Berhain, fantastic researcher, particularly if you're interested in questions about ethics. I think she is one of the sharpest minds working in the field today. Other people. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of her. I'm just thinking about like her many papers that are all very good.
No, we'll definitely make sure we have a link to her. Okay, and then finally, rank your number 1 cause or charity that you want to promote.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think consumer and user-oriented lobbying and research organizations in the data science, machine learning, AI field are great. So the Algorithmic Justice League is one. Data and Society is another. The Center for Democracy and Technology, I think, is the one I'm thinking of. So yeah, basically anyone who's not a corporation who's lobbying and agitating for policy change around tech.
I love Rachael, Dr. Tatman. This has been awesome. For those of you who enjoyed this, check out the YouTube channel. We'll have a link in the show notes, as well as Dr. Tatman has a newsletter, that tinyletter.com, which is RC Tatman. We'll have a link to that as well. If someone does want to find you online, like what's your social platform of choice for them to reach out and connect?
Oh, Twitter. Don't try LinkedIn. I will not answer. It's a graveyard.
What's your handle on Twitter?
It is RCTATMAN.
There you go. Thank you so much for joining me today at Rankable. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. My name is Garrett Sussman of iPullRank. Thank you again for listening, and we will catch you next week. Peace out.